Salvete discipuli, hodie spectatis lecturam quattuordecimam, capitis triginta quattuor, Deponent Verbs. Hodie discemus primum vocabula capitis triginta quattuor, dende grammaticam capitis. We'll learn about deponent verbs, their principal parts, how they conjugate, and a few that take the ablative. Primum discemus verba vocabulorum capitis triginta quattuor. In hoc capite sunt plurima verba, sedicim verba. Arbitror, conor, cresco, egredior, fateor, hortor, loquor, molior, nascor, patior, proficiscor, rusticor, sedeo, sequor, specto, utor. Primum verbum. Arbitror, arbitrari, arbitratus sum. Ego feles esse meliores quam canes arbitror. Quid significat arbitror? Proximum verbum. Conor, conari, conatus sum. Tam fortiter conatus sum, et tam longe progressus sum. Canebant Linkin Park in carmine infine. Quid significat conor? Proximum verbum. Cresco, crescere, crevi, cretum. Luna semper crescit, decrescitque. Quid significat cresco? Luna crescit, decrescitque. Proximum verbum. Egredior, egredi, egressus sum. Elvis ex aedificio egressus est. Quid significat egredior? Proximum verbum. Fateor, fateri, fasus sum. Fateris ne te maleficam esse, inquit persecutor maleficarum. Quid significat fateor? Proximum verbum. Hortor, hortari, hortatus sum. Aragornus milites hortator, ut quam fortissime pugnent. Pro Frodone! Quid significat hortor? Proximum verbum. Loquor, loqui, locutus sum. Facta clarius quam verba loquuntur. Quid significat loquor? Proximum verbum. Molior, moliri, molitus sum. Homines turem in Babylone tam altam moliebantur, ut Deos invideret, et linguas eorum confunderet. Quid significat molior? Proximum verbum. Nascor, nasci, natus sum. Anno 1989, magister vester natus est. Quid significat nascor? Proximum verbum. Patior, pati, passus sum. Nisi Neptunum exasperavis. Nisi Neptunum exasperaviset. Ulixes decem annus a domo sua non passus esset. Quid significat patior? Proximum verbum. Proficiscor, proficisci, profectus sum. Proficiscimor, clamat Bilbo currens. Quid significat proficiscor? Proximum verbum. Rusticor, rusticari, rusticatus sum. Marcus agricola, rusticans boes alet. Quid significat rusticor? Proximum verbum. Sedeo, sedere, sedi, sessum. Homo in pictora sedet. Quid significat sedeo? Proximum verbum. Sequor, sequi, secutus sum. Si tu duces, nos te sequemur. Quid significat sequor? Tu duces, nos sequemur. Ultimum verbum. Utor, uti, usus sum. Senex computatore uti conator. Quid significat utor? Nunc discemus nomina vocabulorum capitis triginte quattuor. In hoc capite sunt tria nomina: anima, remissio, vox. Primum nomen: anima, animae. Discipuli Pythagorae, Platonisque, credebant animam immortalem esse, et in corpora nova migrari. Quid significat anima? Proximum nomen. Remissio, remissiones. Ovidius poeta, et artem amatoriam et remissionem amoris, de initio atque exitio amoris, scripsit. Quid significat remissio? Ultimum nomen. Vox, vocis. Robertus voce maxima canet. Quid significat vox? Nunc discemus adjectiva vocabulorum capitis triginte quattuor. In hoc capite sunt duo adjectiva: adversus, tales. Primum adjectivum: adversus, adversa, adversum. Altera cohors athletarum est adversa alteram. Quid significat adversus? Ultimum adjectivum: tales, tale. Si tales est sacerdos, tales est grex. Quid significat tales? Nunc discemus alias partes loquendi vocabulorum capitis triginte quattuor. In hoc capite est una interjectio: vai. Interjectio vai. Vai victis? Vai victis? Inquit Gallus Brennus Romanis victis. Quid significat vai? Okay, today we are going to learn deponent verbs. Deponent verbs are probably one of the most infuriating and enraging things that a Latin student will encounter up to this point. So please don't shoot the messenger. What are deponent verbs? Well, basically, deponent verbs ask you to go against your instincts and to look at something and believe something else. The explanation for a deponent verb is actually pretty straightforward. They have passive personal endings but are active in meaning. In other words, deponent verbs will only show up with endings that look like they're passive. However, they translate actively, meaning they don't actually have a passive even though the endings look passive. Okay? So yeah, basically, yeah. So as an example, let's look at sequor, sequi, secutus sum. Okay, so this means to follow. And you'll notice that it has three principal parts because it doesn't have a passive. And they all look passive instead of active, even though it translates actively. Sequor is the first principal part. It is the first person singular present active indicative, but that OR ending is characteristic of the first singular passive rather than active. But again, it's a deponent, meaning that it translates actively. Sequor, I follow, I am following. Sequi is the second principal part. Okay, so this is the present active infinitive, to follow, sequi, even though it looks like a passive infinitive. Okay, sequor is a third conjugation verb, and as you'll see, as you saw from many of the examples in the vocab, there are deponent verbs in all four verb conjugations, including third IO. So this is an example of a third conjugation deponent. And as you know, passive infinitives, present passive infinitives for third conjugation verbs just end in a long I. And so that's what's going on here, right? Sequi, just the long I after the stem, means to follow, even though it looks like to be followed. Okay. Finally, the third principal part is the perfect active indicative of the first singular, okay, just like it is for the third principal part of a regular verb, okay? So basically, this is what you use to form the perfect system, okay? The perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect will be formed off of this third principal part, just like any other third principal part. But because it uses passive constructions and endings instead of active endings, it's going to look like a perfect passive indicative, when in fact it is a perfect active indicative, okay? Which means that it's the perfect system, okay, of a deponent verb is necessarily going to involve what looks like a perfect passive participle plus a form of the verb to be as our helping verb, okay? So basically, I'm not going to go through exhaustively all the different forms of deponent verbs take, because you are actually already familiar with all of them, because you now know how to do the passive voice in every tense and mood of every regular verb. Okay, so basically a deponent is just using those same endings we already know. It's just the challenge now is to look at the stem and say, oh, I remember the principal parts. This is a deponent verb. I should translate this as actively. Okay, so I'll give a couple examples just because it's a good idea. Look on the left here. This is the present active indicative of sequor. Okay, sequor, sequeris, sequitur, sequimur, sequimini, sequuntur. I follow, you follow, he follows, we follow, y'all follow, they follow. Okay, so those are the standard passive personal endings for the present system. Okay, but this translates actively. Okay, and it's a third conjugation verb. So remember, depending on the conjugation of the deponent, it's still going to use those same stem vowels that you see. Okay, nothing different there. Let's look at the perfect active. Okay, secutus sum, secutus est, secustus est, etc. Okay, so I followed, you followed, she followed, etc. Okay, because the perfect active is using a participle with a helping verb, it's going to use those case endings with the participle are still going to match the subject in gender, case, and number, and then the helping verb will be modified accordingly. Okay, so secutus sum, I followed, as in I, a dude. Secuta sum, I followed, I, a woman, etc. Okay, so remember that. Whenever you use participles as part of a verb construction, they have to match the subject in gender, case, and number. Okay, and remember, this is perfect active, even though it looks perfect passive. You have to recognize the stem that it's a deponent verb. Okay, so yeah. And just to add insult to injury, some deponent verbs do not take the accusative as their direct object. Now, this is not quite true. What's really going on is that some deponent verbs are not transitive, they're intransitive, and they're using an ablative of means with it. But functionally, you might as well kind of treat it as taking an ablative as its direct object. Okay? So the only verb that we learned in the vocab that does this from this chapter is utor, uti, uzusum, which means to use or to take advantage of, etc. And while the word use in English is a transitive verb, in Latin it is not. It is to kind of derive advantage by means of, is kind of the literal sense here. Okay, so the example I used in the lecture was senex computatore uti conator. Okay, so the old woman tries to use a computer. Okay, so uti is our infinitive. It is a improper infinitive to conator, which itself is a first conjugation deponent verb. She tries, okay, to use a computer. So computator, computatoris, third conjugation, etc. Sorry, third declension. Okay, this is the ablative ending for there. So she tries to make use of a computer, whatever we want to think of it as. Okay, so utor takes the ablative as its object, essentially. Okay, and if you're curious, these are the other four verbs that generally take the ablative. Okay, fruor meaning to enjoy, fungor meaning to also to use in a sense, and potior meaning to acquire. All right, so we'll get those probably in later chapters. Okay, but just a heads up, ablative with special opponents are a thing, and that's it for the grammar for this chapter. So again, the best thing you can do for deponents is to memorize the principal parts of the vocab so that you know that they're deponents when you recognize the stem, and so you translate it actively rather than passively. Okay, I can't stress that enough. And with that, lēctūra discipuli.